Dan Murphy, for those of you that don't know, ESPN staff writer. He's been covering a ton of what's been going on within the NIL landscape. He's someone who, for my money, if there's ever an article that's popping up from Dan, it's a must read for myself, and I know a bunch of other folks that have spent a ton of time kind of in the space. Really look at you to provide kind of sharp insights and perspectives on what's going on, and so we're super excited to have you joining us here today. Same as kind of we always do, just for folks on the phone, we'll provide Dan's, highly recommend you give him a follow on Twitter. Highly recommend you find his articles on ESPN. We'll provide the recording after this, and certainly link up some of those pieces so that you can dive even deeper into Dan. But really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm actually gonna shift my stuff so I don't look so backlit. But how are we doing today?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff. I think I've been in the weeds in it now for like 3, 4, 5 years, and people who are also in the weeds are fun to talk to about getting into the nuances and wonky stuff of this, because there is no end to the wonky stuff you can get into when it comes to this world that we're in now, I think.
Yeah, and just to provide one little personal anecdote into the relationship that you and I have started pretty recently is I didn't get the chance to make it, but we did get the chance to meet in Vegas, and you got to see the show that I wish I could have seen, which was Dead and Co in the Sphere, and I just have to know how it was.
Yeah, I made an early pilgrimage to start NACTA out with Dead and Co, which was a much different vibe than the hallways of the Mandalay Bay.
I'm sure.
But it was incredible for anybody who's interested in a totally unique concert to experience. I'm not, no sponsors for the Sphere here, but it was really cool. Totally worth checking out.
I know. I wish I could have made it there a day earlier to have been there with you. And I've heard nothing but incredible things. And I've got a couple of Deadhead friends out there that have seen it. They didn't see that exact show, but they've got a little kind of residency there for a couple months. So, but anyways, for those of you that don't want to talk about jam bands, we'll get Dan on the right track and have a handful of topics that honestly kind of in real time are becoming more and more exciting and important every single day. And would just love to kind of get your thoughts and opinions on what you're seeing and hearing within the space. Same kind of rules applies, audience. Feel free to drop in questions in real time, and we'll try to hit them as quickly as I can. But wanting to start kind of Dan on your side. So house settlement, NCAA rules adjustments, D1 council, even over the past 24, 48 hour, making different kind of adjustments to the NIL world. Like, from your perspective, from your chair, where do you see kind of the ball going as it relates to NIL?
It's exciting because I think the things that we've been talking about is stuff that's probably coming for 2 or 3 years now. If not quite has arrived, is at least clearly right ahead, and it's less hypothetical than it's been for a long time. There are fewer ifs that I have to put at the start of sentences that I'm writing these days. And yeah, I think it's interesting. I would imagine it's really cool. Talking to people in athletic departments and schools right now, they have the ability to start making some of these decisions, I think, of are they going to do this all in-house? Are they going to, find some other way? Are their collectives going to be around? How are they going to split up this money? Where are they going to find the money? It's time to actually start making those decisions. And I find that to be a pretty exciting time after 3 or 4 years of just talking about it.
Yeah, I think it's been really exciting to see kind of a new conversation come into the NIL world where you're not having to deal with the hypotheticals. You're starting to plan around real concrete kind of realities that are, still coming into focus in some ways, but at least much more clear than it's ever been before. A lot of the folks that we've been hearing from, Title IX, FOIA, employment, even 501(c)(3 risk and liabilities, from the folks that you're talking to in the space, like where do you see kind of the still kind of gray within, this, still changing kind of landscape?
Yeah, so the two sort of biggest unanswered questions about how this market takes shape and sort of how the economy of getting talented players on your campus changes in the next few years are Title IX and the what happens with collectives and whether or not the the forward-looking part of the House settlement is really a hard cap on spending on athletes, that 20-ish million dollar figure, or whether that's a much softer cap where for the most wealthy schools and schools in most of the power conferences, that becomes more of a floor than a ceiling. And I don't think we have clear answers on that. I know, next week or within the next couple weeks, we'll get the form fine print of the House settlement, which will be a part of a public court disclosure. So I'm very excited to dig into that and learn some extra details. And hopefully,
When is that coming out?
it's got to be within 30 to 45 days of when they sort of shook hands on their initial agreement.
Gotcha.
And so that was in late May. So late June, early July was always the expected date. So I would think sometime in the next couple weeks at the latest, we'll get a look at that long form and everyone will be able to sort of pour through the fine print. And I don't think that will answer every question. I think there's still, the big Title IX question of, do I have to, do I split this money up 50-50 or proportionally close to that with my men's teams and women's teams, or can I do this based on who raises the most revenue? It's been really interesting to talk to different athletic departments about that because it's split kind of. I hear some people that say, oh, we're going to have to do 50-50, and others say, well, no, this is going to be something where we can get 75 to 80% of this to the football team, which is sort of where it would make sense in an open market, if not even more than that in an open market, where all that money would flow to football. And I think that's a really important distinction, not only for like what this looks like going forward, but like whether or not the settlement gets challenged over the course of the next 4 or 5 months. There are some pretty big hurdles left to clear. And if somehow we found out, like, for example, right, that Title IX is going to be a 50-50 split, most of the big football programs are going to be taking pay cuts. Their payrolls will be smaller on that money than they would be with the collectives. And if I'm a football player or somebody who advocates for football players, and there's a couple organizations out there in the process of trying to organize folks, that would be an easy pain point for football players to say, hey, if this goes through, you're going to take a pay cut. Let's opt out of this and challenge it somewhere else and bargain this differently, because there's been some efforts to do that. Some of those answers, especially the Title IX one, I think could have a big impact on whether or not this actually gets stamped and signed and finished in the next few months.
I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but it does feel like most of the schools in the North are saying more 50-50. Most of the schools in the South are saying football, men's basketball, women's basketball, and then we'll figure out the remaining 5%, how we split that up. I don't know if you're hearing kind of similar.
That's very much been my experience. Yeah. I don't know that there's any like complete obvious divide, but yeah, I think that's, it seems like it's very regionally based decision making at this point, conference by conference somewhat, but it's interesting too. Like a lot of times this will be a conference or even multiple conferences get together and sort of pick a path forward. But I've found that more so than I can remember in the last 10 years or so of covering college sports, there's a little bit less of that collegiality. Let's all figure it out together. And I think there's part of that comes from realizing that figuring it all out together is an antitrust problem that is sort of what got them into this problem in the first place. And part of it is that like there are so many, it's such a wide open board of options right now for how schools might be able to play this game moving forward and try to get a leg up on one another, that I think schools are being more guarded with information because there's a competitive edge to be gained if you figure out the right formula, because everyone's going to have a slightly different formula, right, I think, over the course of the next few years.
Data is becoming more and more valuable wherever you look, including college athletics now.
No doubt.
As far as kind of the student athlete experience goes, you kind of talked about, we've had, CEOs of AO, we've talked with a bunch of other folks like, within that space that I think are trying to, mobilize student athletes to this thing to be seated for a longer term kind of solution, or is that something that's going to kind of work itself out as schools start presenting these athletes deals and it's just how
probably ideal form of the most efficient market for this is a collective bargaining agreement. But that is really hard to do in college sports for all kinds of reasons that I think most people on this call probably recognize, right? Just the vast disparity between even football player, every college football player as a union would be a tough group with a lot of different interests and different levels of value to a market. Um, and I think in some ways that's sort of what the lawyers in the House settlement are trying so they're trying to create a collective bargaining agreement without collectively bargaining in some ways, right? Where they are sort
Yeah,
of standing in as the voice of the athletes in a way that, depending on how you look at it, is either like done in the name of efficiency or sort of paternalistic in some way of we have to do this because the athletes aren't going to organize themselves. And in fairness, it's been really hard to organize athletes. I think even the guys like AO you
right,
mentioned, College Football Players Association, a couple others will tell you it's a really uphill battle because for a lot of college athletes, they feel like they're living a good life right now, right? They're getting more than they did
right,
before. They're getting catered to on campus. And I think to a large degree, the NCAA's bet here is that the 20 plus extra $1 million a year that they distribute to athletes, plus everything else that they already get, will be enough that no athlete is going to want to lend his or her name to the next class action lawsuit and opt out from the benefits that they're offered. And I think that's sort of where the math probably falls if you're trying to figure out how they got to this, 20 plus $1 million number. Is this going to be enough to keep athletes happy enough that they're not going to want to do the hard work of organizing? Because you need to really want it in order to organize a labor
right.
movement.
I heard that the math on kind of like where this cap falls, when you layer on top of it scholarships and Alston payments and stipends and like per diem and travel, like it actually gets pretty close to what the standard kind of rates are, even at the professional league. So it's 20% rev sharing and then probably another 20% across all other benefits to get closer to 40%. So I mean, I understand and can get a sense for why you need the voice of the athlete as part of this negotiation. Otherwise, it kind of feels like you're within the echo chamber of yourself trying to negotiate this stuff. But it doesn't feel like it's that egregious. I don't know if you're hearing that from athletes or others as you're talking to them.
So yeah, look, like we're going to naturally be skeptical of any of this stuff because of the long history of it, and because as a journalist,
Sure.
kind of the occupational hazard. But it is worth noting, Jeffrey Kessler, Steve Berman, the guys that were sort of negotiating on behalf of athletes in that room. Kessler has a 40-year career of advocating for athletes and changing the face of professional sports across the board on what athletes get, and sort of in a way that has helped athletes immensely. And Berman has been suing the NCAA for 20 years. So these guys aren't like sort of shills that are just there to get their
Right.
paycheck necessarily.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be a very nice paycheck. They've done a lot of work on behalf of athletes. So I think, yeah, it's right to assume that some of this is somewhat a fair deal. The part about, most pro leagues, most labor markets in general, the main workforce gets about 50% of the revenue that's generated in the industry. And so I think this raises another point that I find really interesting over maybe the next 5 or 10 years so the House settlement in some ways will make a more clear distinction between your group of five schools and your power
Sure.
conferences, of
Sure.
who's going to be able to actually pay that money, right? I think most power conferences are going to find a way to come up with as close to that 20 million figure as they can, if not more. And most of the group of fives are sort of conceding that, hey, we're not going to be able to play in that pond. We just don't have it.
Right.
For the lower quadrant, maybe 8, 10 dozen teams, exact, somewhere around that number, among the power conference schools, that it does approach 50% of revenue. For the top 12, 15, 20 college
Yeah.
schools,
Fair.
it doesn't even come close. There is still so much disparity between, even within the power conferences, on what their revenues and expenses look like, especially in football, right? It balances out a little bit across athletic departments, but if you just look at football exclusively as a sport, the amount of money that Alabama spends versus the amount of money that Washington State spends on an annual basis, we're talking about like triple, close to quadruple the expense
Yeah.
budget for a football program. So that looks a lot different. And if I'm a player in the Big Ten or the SEC, I might be looking at this and say, I'm only getting 20 to 30% rather than 50%. And there's some disparity there.
in terms of the athletic departments operationalizing this stuff, like where do you see the biggest kind of liabilities for them? And do you see kind of this agency model, like I'll probably even say more broadly, like a third party administrator type of a model taking shape on these within these departments, or do you think there will truly be direct payments out to student athletes in the same way that they pay their coaches?
So with the caveat of every answer I probably give you, right, is I don't know
Yeah, of
for
course.
sure. Nobody knows, right?
Yeah,
But like
right.
with that caveat, my guess is we'll see both at
No,
least.
dude, we're holding you to it, and we're
Yeah,
gonna.
yeah. Print it, and freezing cold takes Twitter account can hold me accountable.
Yeah.
Um, no, I think we'll probably see both over the course of the next few years, and then one model might emerge as the one that makes more sense than the other, and people will convert over to it. But I think the part that's kind of cool and exciting about this right now is there's, like I said, this wide open board for people to make plays on at this point, and we're going to see a little bit of everything.
Uh,
But um,
it's so cool to me because we're getting to. I mean, listen, it's really really tough for the administrators and probably even
sure.
the athletes and that are having to deal with the pain of having to figure out how to operationalize this stuff. But I would like for companies and folks that are trying to bring solutions into the industry, it's 2021 all over again. Like
Yeah.
we are redevising the entire landscape for college athletics in a new model. So it's to me kind of fascinating to see like, hey, we thought that this was all going to be like the last time we have to deal with this in the middle of 2021, and we're basically resetting all the chips. Like, hey guys, like come back to the table and we're going to try this whole thing again. And I think you're seeing similar types of things of who's going to be the first movers, who's going to take the first steps, who's going to kind of like go out on the limb. Um, yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. You're seeing it in real time.
Yeah, agreed. One of my like with the previous point we were just making, right, where some of the richer schools it doesn't quite get to that 50%. Like I'm very curious to know, like I think in the eyes of certainly Charlie Baker and a lot of the power conference commissioners, they're hoping that what they're doing now is a big enough bite and change that like this might be the last time they have to do it. And I'm very curious to know whether or not this is just another incremental step toward eventually the top 30, 40, whatever number of schools splitting away even more so and creating something a little bit different. But yeah, that's a little far afield from what you were originally asking there.
I don't know. I mean, we're all just waiting for the power to do whatever they decide is next. I mean, that's I don't know. I don't see many other like huge step function unless the NFL just decides to buy college football, and then we're just a subset of a subset. But um, bringing up Charlie Baker, a lot of folks have said, "Hey, this is kind of Charlie's move to get rid of collectives once and for all." It doesn't feel like maybe the word collective will go away. It feels like the mechanics of a collective are not going away, and they're kind of popping up in the form of agencies or these third party administrators. Like, I mean, do you see a world in which maybe the word goes away, but that kind of like third party model is going to be within the landscape, or do you think that there is a way to kind of get that all within the four walls of the department?
Yeah, I think in some way it makes sense to have that third party. And I think maybe there's probably two functions, and schools might choose one or both or neither of these functions moving forward that a collective can serve. One is sort of as like a payroll solution company of, hey, we already have the software, we already have the way to do this, which schools don't have, right? When schools don't have a solution, is this going to come through your financial aid office or through your marketing budget or whatever it may be? Is it just easier to cut a check to the collective and let them distribute that money in some way so that you don't have to hire out new staff to solve that problem? And then the other part of even if the sort of NIL as a stand-in de facto salary as it's become over the past couple of years, even if they are able to stem that or take that away, which I think remains a pretty big if. There is still the legitimate endorsement value dollars out there in local
Right.
communities that schools, I think at this point, are going to be committed to going to find for their athletes in order to gain another competitive edge. That's another battle in the arms race of recruiting, that if you have a really functional collective that works almost like a Learfield does in going to find local sponsorships with the grocery store, the pizza shop, or more broadly regional chains or something like that that you can involve your athletes in. The way that collectives have evolved, I think, over the past few years to go from, initially the rich boosters passing a hat in a circle to now a really, for most of them, a really professional setup that looks more like, and honestly is staffed by the same people that used to
Right,
staff the development of
right.
their university or from Learfield or something like that have the know-how in the background to go, chase down those more legitimate marketing opportunities for athletes. I don't see that going away at all. I think that continues to be another sort of selling point when you're trying to recruit an athlete.
Yeah, it's funny. A Power Four school that's a partner of ours. We were just visiting them, and they were talking about even the recruiting process of bringing that piece of the puzzle and equation into the recruiting kind of discussion of, hey, you're going to get your rev share dollars, you're going to get your stipends and scholarships and all the fun stuff that comes with it, and then we're not only going to be able to give you incremental dollars on top of that through an agency collective, but we're going to help you build your brand, and we're going to create content around you, and we're going to develop you, as a more than just student athlete XYZ. It's now we've got a docu-series about you, and we're creating a whole bunch of different kind of you know assets and pieces of content that will further advance you as you step forward into the next phase of your personal and professional life. It's and I don't know how you can get that out of the world. It would be like telling Learfield like you can't sell the assets. Like um I just
I
don't.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways they're hoping that the $20 million pot of money sort of satiates the market in some way, right? Where for some schools that might, right? If you're
Right.
we don't like to pick on it, but like whatever, we'll pick on some particular schools here because the reality is there. If you're Oregon State and you want to pay that $20 million, you probably can't afford to have the sixth staffer who's going to help someone build their brand or cut YouTube videos or something like that. If you're Ohio State, you can pay that $20 million and still have a really robust NIL help out arm of your athletic department, like schools have been building for the past couple of years. And I think that's another point where we may see schools with more resources continue to pull themselves away. Because if they have an extra dollar to spend to go get the better athlete, someone's going to find a way to spend it. And I think that the type of services you were just talking about may end up being, a new place where that money is funneled if the market isn't
Right.
satiated.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like there will always be an arms race, particularly at kind of that, as you were describing, like the upper tier of the upper tier. Like
Yeah.
Alabama is always going to want to be Georgia. Like Michigan is always going to want to beat Ohio State. Those are the types of places where I think you're just going to have a different kind of conversation. Maybe taking shifting the view on this just slightly, looking at it from a different angle. This feels to me like that maybe an exciting time for anyone that's interested in being a general manager, because there's probably 150 new GM jobs that are opening up at a on a football team near you. Like right now, you've got 32 and the NFL teams, and all of a sudden there's a huge need for folks that understand how to manage a budget and a roster together. Have you been hearing, I anecdotally hear like, oh yeah, we went and visited with our, local pro team and like got some ideas from them on how to manage. Like, where do you see that side of the house moving?
Yeah, I think that's another one where there's like I see maybe three options, right, for schools that I've heard sort of exploring, right? Either you take your existing staff and sort of convert them and hope they pick up new skills or convert some of what they can do into being more analytical or building a roster in some way. The second way is you go hire folks out, and I have talked to athletic directors who've thought, said we're thinking about wholesale. If we were building from scratch, how would we build our athletic department now? And would it look significantly different? And I think in a lot of cases, if you're starting over, it would. if you want it, if you have the resources and the time to start over to rebuild like that. And then the third option that I think a lot of people are exploring is, can we outsource it in some way, right? We already outsource a lot of our stuff, and we don't, if we're going to be spending, and we've got to find another $20 million in the budget. I can't go hire 6 more really smart people with experience in the general manager world, which is already a really
Sure.
small pool. How in the world am I going to make these hires and staff changes to afford this? And it might be easier just to go, hire Basepath. Not trying to toot your horn too much here, right? But like like that's the kind of options that people are exploring. I'm
We'll
sure.
take it, dude.
Yeah. And we talked about this a little bit in Las Vegas, right? Where like I think it's an incredibly unique job because a football GM has to understand the relative value of a linebacker versus an offensive tackle versus a quarterback. The GM at a school, maybe they'll have each one for an individual team, but there's going to have to be somebody who's taking that big $20+ million pot of money and allocating it by sport as well. So you may be in a position where you have to understand the relative value of the center on your basketball team versus the left tackle on your football team versus the star point guard on your women's basketball team, and figuring out which percentage of that pie each of them deserves in the best
Right.
possible scenario, which is a puzzle that I don't think anyone in sports has ever had to
Yeah.
solve before. It's a pretty cool one.
It's a wild one. Yeah, like, hey, if we invest $400,000 in this basketball center, it will give our basketball team 4 more wins, which gives us X more dollars in, revenue, and it gives us a chance to compete for a NCAA tournament bid, and we can get yeah. Versus if we put that into the football team, like, does that get us one extra win and qualify for us a bowl or
And what's the football win count versus a 5
right?
basketball wins? How do you do that, Matt? Right? The Bill James of the world are lighting up the building of
Yeah.
trying to solve some of these things, I think.
Yeah, somewhere in the background, all the Moneyball guys are just lurking and figuring out, like, hey, we can do it for 40 sports instead of one.
Yeah.
Super super fascinating. Is it relates to kind of how those departments are starting to organize themselves? Like, are you seeing any trends kind of shaping up, or do you think it is still kind of, hey, let's wait for the dust to settle a little bit further before we start making tactical decisions?
I think it's I think it's a little bit early. I think a lot of them are still wrapping their heads around the question is like, where are we going to get this money from? And some of it is cuts, and some of it is finding new revenue streams. That's probably the first question to answer. And then you get into, okay, I'm sure the conversations are happening right now. What's our strategy and how do we build it out and where do we find an edge? But this is another part where I think, for reporters and for anybody, it's a little bit harder because, as we said at the beginning, people are seeing this as a way to gain a competitive edge. And so they're holding
Sure.
their cards a little bit closer to their vest than maybe they have been on other sort of evolutions of how you go out and recruit
Right.
talent. And, so it's probably a little bit of both,
People,
right?
people are a little bit more willing to tell you how they, updated their, facilities versus how they're updating their, roster management tools.
It's certainly easier to get a tour of the new locker room as a reporter than it is to get a tour at, like, here's what the budget looks like and how we're going to
Right.
be hiring and that kind of
Yeah.
thing. It is like down to like the way you structure a contract for each athlete is wide open, right? Do
Sure.
you backload it to get them to stick around? Do you pay them on a monthly basis or a weekly? Like all of that stuff, it seems like by design is being left at the campus level, which means that there's this big sandbox for a lot of different ways, a lot of different iterations of that to play out. And it's going to be interesting to see which one of those, if any of those prove to be more successful than the others.
I mean, I think certainly the NCAA wants to provide some of that clarity in the form of, like, consolidation of at least data, but even to that point, like, getting into the nitty-gritty of contracts, into, capology, like, those are things that just, I think, are beyond the purview of really kind of any governing body, and certainly one that, I don't understand how you could even have the capacity to do that unless you just force folks to give it up.
Especially because every time they try to make a decision as a group, it leads to an antitrust lawsuit, right? That's what's
Right.
got them into this problem in the first place. So I do think there's at least a public facing part of this where very much they're saying we're hands off. We're not telling schools what to do. This is an open competitive market. Please don't sue us for antitrust on any of this stuff.
On the you brought it up a couple times, kind of the budget stress and strain that this is going to put on folks. I've kind of two questions on that one. One, we're starting to hear across D1, so from Power Four down to, low level FCS. Um, the way that this settlement, at least the payback on the settlement has been kind of laid out, it feels like it's overburdening some of the folks on the lower end and, maybe a little bit easier on the folks at the higher end. Like, are you feeling any kind of discomfort and pain? I think I saw like there was a lawsuit that was floating around or something along those lines. And then just so I don't forget it, the rev share dollars coming back in 25 on the TV contracts. So like, are we in just kind of a short term, like little budget crisis will get resolved when these TV rev share, when the new TV contracts kick in and the new college football playoff contracts kick in and some of those other ones? So sorry, I had that one in my head earlier and I forgot it. I want to make sure I at least add it in before I lost it again. But
I think I
between
have
those two.
both of those in my head at the same time. So
Yeah.
first on the small schools versus big schools debate. Yeah, there was I think it was a school out of Houston, Division I AAA school out of Houston, I think, maybe even smaller than that, had objected to the terms of the settlement. They didn't file a separate lawsuit, but everyone has an opportunity to object to the settlement. And this school said we weren't represented at the table. We didn't agree to this, so we're going to object to it. We want the judge to take that into consideration. So far, there's only been one school that's done that. I think there's been some fairly outspoken conference commissioners from smaller leagues saying this isn't fair to us. And I understand their concern because most of that money that everyone is and I think it's worth clarifying here, right? The money that we're talking about the schools quote unquote paying, it isn't money that's actually in their bank account and they're going to give back to the NCAA. It's money that the NCAA otherwise would have distributed to them that is no longer going to land in their bank accounts over the course of the next year. So it's not really taking money out of their pockets so much as not putting.
It's reduced distributions, but that's essentially the same thing because a lot of these schools are planning on those distributions for their budget.
Right. And that money will go largely to Power Five athletes, even more largely to Power Five.
Well, and that to me is where the math gets weird. It's like, hey, say it's 50-50 between Power Four and everyone else. The dollars are going to go 80-20 to Power Four. Would be my guess. I don't know. I haven't looked at the math of it, but that's my assumption.
We should get a look at the actual math of it, I think, when the long form thing comes out here in the next couple of weeks. There's a sports economist who spent a lot of time on this, who I think was an expert witness as part of the earlier in the case, who is now the person who's sort of sorting through those numbers and deciding what different categories of athletes are there going to be for the back payment part of this, and how do you determine where the line is for each of those categories. And so I think a lot of that math will be in the long form stuff that comes out in the next couple of weeks, so the judge will have to look at that and approve it. And that may impact, that will be interesting to see in its own right. It may also impact the forward-looking money in some way, where you say, okay, well, here's a rubric that maybe we can use if let's say 75-80% of that money ends up going to your football and men's basketball players. There are schools that are planning on taking that number and saying this is how we can justify spending 75-80% of the forward-looking money on football and basketball players when it comes to a potential Title IX challenge for how they spend that money. But yeah, on the other hand, so that's the argument for the small schools, right? We're losing a bunch of money and it's all going to go to your players. On the other hand, there are plenty of people in the power conferences that would have wanted to share more with schools sooner and felt restrained because of the rules that everyone in Division I agreed to. If you're a small Division I school, you had at least some role, although we can go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, how much control you had over making these rules, but at least, theoretically, you had control over these rules, and the rules are the reason that
you were on the D1 council like everyone else was. You had your seat at the table.
Sure. Yeah. And in a certain sense, like most of that money that they're getting through distributions is value that's generated by the power conferences to begin with. So they're getting a smaller distribution check, but most of the big
actually makes sense.
The distribution check, most of that pot that's coming out of that money is generated because Kentucky plays North Carolina in the Final Four, not because St. Peter's plays.
That's the first bullet point on it that I'm like, that makes sense. I can understand that a little bit better now because you're right. the revenues that are being distributed are way more outsized in terms of the top 50% that are generating them versus the others.
Yeah, and I think the smaller schools are going to feel that pain because they're already at the bone, right? They have fewer places, they have fewer fat places to trim fat, and the Kentuckys and North Carolinas of the world might be able to, and they're still footing, from a dollar sense, a bigger part of the bill, but from a percentage sense, not as much. Your other question about
breaking news, by the way, Dan Murphy is officially defending the NCAA's stance within
neither side. I'm giving up both arguments.
Yeah,
You brought up the other point earlier about the college football playoff contract and all that kicks in, which is a pretty interesting scenario where schools, as long as everything goes according to plan, will start, cutting checks to athletes or cutting checks to their collectives to cut to athletes next fall, 14 months from now, and they'll have to find that money. But 2 years from now, in the fiscal year 27, I guess it is. I think I've got that right. The big increased college football playoff contract kicks in, and all of a sudden, at least for those power conferences, there's a lot more money, a big increase in money flowing that some of them may have already sort of accounted or allotted to some future expenditure, but it may actually it will ease the pain of having to come up with that $20 million. So there's this weird gap year that some schools may have to fill, or some schools may have to say, hey, we're just not going to max out the cap during this first year. We're going to figure it out and we'll build up toward it. I think you'll see a handful of schools in sort of that bottom half of the power conference.
Is that private equity's like chance? It feels to me like that's been like, hey, private equity's floating around, like there's it's going to be Florida State, it's going to be here, it's going to be there, it's going to be
yeah,
and it hasn't really taken place. That to me feels like a natural kind of entry point of like, hey, if we know we have a shortfall, a short-term shortfall with much larger inflows kind of coming down the road, like I could see a world in which someone would step in there and say, hey, let me help solve that problem for you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely when we talk about finding new sources of revenue, one of them is taking on an investor, and I think that's a place where private equity pops in. The other thing I think that's interesting about private equity is when we talk about maybe all of these big TV contracts turn over roughly in the early 2030s, and when they do, in my mind, the next round of conference realignment is conference consolidation, where the big TV networks, and I work at ESPN, but I am not on the level of people having these conversations. So let me be clear. This is my guessing at things and trying to read tea leaves, not any advanced knowledge here.
Yeah.
But my guess is those TV networks.
They don't include you in on the 2030 calls?
No, for some reason I'm not on that meeting. Those conferences networks are going to go to the Big Ten and say, we love Ohio State versus Michigan, Purdue versus Illinois or Rutgers. Sorry to pick on those schools, but they're not moving the needle as much for us, and we're kind of carrying weight there. And you guys would be better off to drop them. And I think we're going to, that sort of what we talked about earlier, where there's still a big divide among the power conferences, and is there another big split yet to come? I think that might happen when the TV contracts roll over and people can kind of reorganize themselves. And so that means there's an undetermined amount of schools that, let's say, get to ride on get to sit at the big kids table in the future, in a decade from now, in this big league, if it happens. And everyone's going to be scrambling to make sure that they are competitively relevant when that time comes, when that the earth splits open and you have to be on one side or the other. And now that you can pay players directly, one way to make sure you're going to be relevant competitively is making sure that you're maxing out every dollar you can spend on the recruiting trail. And so there's an opportunity there, I think, for private equity to go find a few of those schools in the bubble that are going to be struggling to pay enough to compete with Alabama and Michigan and Texas financially. Say, hey, float us for the next 5 years so that we can jump in on this the Super League if it manifests. And you'll get your payback there, because the revenue will be that much larger if we have this sort of semi-pro college league in the future.
Makes a ton of sense. I'm going to open it up to some questions here, but thanks for entertaining all of my questions, and at least some of the ones that as I was talking to folks who knew I was talking to you, they tossed a couple in there for me. But just one that came in, Dan, what do you see as the biggest risk to college athletics today?
I think one thing we haven't talked about is the employment question. I think that reshapes a lot of stuff if athletes become employees. And I think with this revenue share deal, while it solves some of the problems and I think makes a lot of sense, I don't see how uh, they can they will I think they will lose the NLRB cases and potentially the Johnson case and every other employment challenge, where it makes it a much harder battle than it already was. It seems like they are really counting on Congress to help them out with the employment thing, and they've made a little progress there, right? Like, incremental. It seems like people are a little more open to the idea of, okay, you're doing more for players. We understand you might need a special status, and there's all these other issues, whether it's workers' comp or sort of union, how you deal with athletes in the future if they're
Well,
employees.
to that point, I saw that I think it was like a subcommittee voted on something
Yeah.
that like allows for the bill to go to the floor. It still looked like it was voted across party lines, but like, is that a step in the right direction? Is that a good
It's
signal for the NCAA?
Yeah, I think so. It's far, far, far from the finish line, right? It is still the first scene in
Yeah,
the Schoolhouse Rock of how a bill becomes a law kind of thing, but like it's got a few steps and like getting, I mean, and it gets interesting too because I don't think anything's going to happen before November and the election
sure.
coming. Just time wise, everyone's out on the campaign trail now. We got our first presidential debates already tonight. We're not going to get
I
to
know.
November before a law. I will not be tuning into those, but
Yeah,
the the question of like, right now the Democrats control the Senate and the Republicans have a slight control of the House, and this has become a really partisan issue where Republicans are sort of happy to give the NCAA the employment special status that they want and some antitrust cover, and Democrats want to push the NCAA to do much more or potentially push for athletes to be able to bargain collectively at the far end of what's been proposed from Democrats. And so depending on who wins those elections, that will actually potentially have some pretty serious impact on what the future of college sports looks like. And so when we talk about the biggest challenge or biggest threats facing college sports, the employment question is a really big one. And I think it's a big threat because so much of it is outside of their control. Just even, you can get the brightest minds in the room with the best plans, but there's only so much they can do on that front.
makes a ton of sense. And I know looks like we had another one pop in. Uh, do you believe the collectives will reclassify from a 501(c)(3) status if they become marketing arms of the universities? Or do you think they'll maintain that 501(c)(3) for fundraising purposes and kind of more traditional business formation for the marketing third party? So I think maybe the short version of that question is, do 501(c)(3) collectives still exist in your mind?
So I'm a little bit out of my depths on IRS tax law and all that kind of stuff. So my understanding though is that I think uh, it's already hard for a collective to sort of justify itself as a 501(c)(3) because if you're spending 90 to 100% of your money in giving it directly to players, that's a private benefit as opposed to, a nonprofit is supposed to exist to create something for the public good and put money toward the public good. And that's pretty hard to justify. I think I don't know, I guess is the real answer to the question, but I think it'd be
Sure.
interesting to see to what degree those get folded into schools because it's easier if it's
Yeah.
folded into an arm of a school to say, hey, this is part of the greater educational mission of the school and we use it as marketing. And it's easier to fit that under the nonprofit status if it's under the school's umbrella than if it's its private thing.
I would just say from our side, the trend that we're seeing is less 501(c)(3) collectives and more donations directly to the foundations of the institutions themselves. And so the institution is kind of taking on that, hey, we can help you with the tax deductibility question and give you, Mr. or Mrs. Donor, the benefit that you're looking for, and we can divert those funds back to NIL in some capacity. And whether that's directly back to the collective to pay the athletes, or if it's, hey, we're going to use this as a marketing expense for an agency to help us to ultimately get it to the athletes. That's a question that I think is unique from school to school. But I will say that does feel like something that we're starting to see more and more of, kind of as this continues to evolve. Um, at Dan Murphy, ESPN on
Yeah,
Twitter.
Twitter.
Honestly, dude, I mean it truly. Like anytime I see an article coming out from you, it's a must read in my mind. And I know Again, you're providing some of the sharpest perspective and insight in the space, and so cannot thank you enough for taking the time to join us today, dude.
Well, thanks. No, it's like I said, it's fun to have conversations with people who are really in the weeds on this stuff and understand it. So I've enjoyed the back and forth here. It's great.
All right. Well, folks, we'll send out the recording here in the next day or so, and we'll certainly send out, some of the articles and socials for Dan, so you can follow along with him on the journey of continuing to demystify all this for us, for the pleasure of us. Well, but really appreciate it, man. Thanks so much.
Have a good one.